Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin. We have Jonathan here.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about two things today. One is Trump has said he wants to abolish the Department of Education, and he's working on an executive order to do that. So we're going to just dive into what the Department of Education actually is and what's sort of the motivation behind this. And the second thing that we're going to talk about is the upcoming debt ceiling fight. The Republicans have announced their blueprint, both in the Senate and the House, and they're pretty far apart right now. And we believe that this is the Democrats' best opportunity to actually use some leverage and maybe find their footing so that they can fight back. Because right now it seems like they're getting punched in the face.
Over and over. It's kind of a clown show out there. And in sort of honoring the clown show motif for the week, I have a clown show beverage, right? No offense to the people over at Hoplark, but I'm not a fan of hop water. This is the newest trend in like non-alcoholic type beverages that are sort of beer adjacent. So they make it with actual hops. It's carbonated water with hops, mosaic hops in this instance. So it kind of smells like a beer. It has sort of a dank, piney aroma, and it tastes nothing like a beer. It tastes like mineral water with hops. Right, so you get, again, a little bit of the dank pininess, a little bit of fruit flavors come through in water. So I don't know what the big deal is with hop water. It just strikes me as something that makes me think, I wish I had a beer instead. None of the warmth, none of the depth to the flavor, just a little bit of hops over the top. I guess if you're looking for something, if you really like hop flavors and you want something non-alcoholic with 0 calories to drink during the day, hop water could be for you. It's just not really for me. And building on the clown show motif, RFK was confirmed this week. And, Republicans are thinking, he won't be that much of a threat. And they're talking through their ass at us, pretending that it's business as usual, that we're putting a vaccine denier in the White House. And sure enough, there are actual ramifications. Louisiana has already come out and said, you know what? We are not going to advertise anymore and not going to recommend mass and vaccination anymore. Vaccination should be custom tailored to you and your needs, and it should be up to people and their doctors. So we won't have statewide campaigns to get get vaccination, which is just a grand approach to public health. New Orleans, for its part, has said, you know what? No, we're actually going to keep doing that. So at least there's something in the most congested part of the state. People will still hopefully be vaccinated. But in case you're wondering, there was a vaccine or a measles outbreak. I want to say it was rural Texas.
Yes.
It was like 25 people, all unvaccinated. 9 of them went to the hospital. So that's a third of these people in this measles outbreak were hospitalized in a very small outbreak. And imagine if that starts expanding exponentially as entire states start to encourage people to, you can pass on the vaccination. It's up to you. It's like, clown show.
And we can't forget Tulsi either. She was confirmed. And it's just a very interesting time that we live in when Mitch McConnell is leading the resistance.
Well, I do believe Susan Collins was concerned, though, wasn't she?
Yes.
Man,
yeah.
Bunch of cowards.
Yep.
It's shameless cowards in that. How can nobody say, you know what? We can't go down that rabbit hole or we'll never get out. And there are a lot of issues this week, and we had a hard time picking what we wanted to do. And we picked a few days in advance because we want to be able to spend some time for ourselves, gathering our thoughts and marshaling our arguments. And so we're not talking this week about the just rampant corruption that's going on in New York with trying to dismiss the Eric Adams case. We're planning at this point to come back to that next week because it is just ridiculously outrageous. So barring some even grander outrage, we'll be talking about that next week.
All right. Before we jump into the Department of Education, I wanted to talk about the blueprint that the House and Senate Republicans have come up with. So as I mentioned to in the intro, the Republicans, their strategy in the House is to get Trump's tax cuts and to also go after mandatory spending. And mandatory spending is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. There are a few other things, but those are the big ones. And they're trying to get all this done before March, mid-March, which is when the debt ceiling is hit. And the Senate, they're looking at the situation and they're saying, yeah, this isn't going to happen. Let's just raise the debt ceiling. We're going to add some more money for immigration enforcement so that Trump can enact his agenda. And we're going to increase defense spending because that's what we do as Republicans. And we'll address the tax cut issue at a later point.
Interesting side note about sort of increasing immigration spending on immigration. I was reading today that enforcement is way down at the border because nobody's coming. I think it was something like 91% fewer encounters this month than before Trump took over. Right? It's just so they seem to be pretty effective with the money they have. It won't stop them from adding more, though, I'm sure.
Right. So over the past couple of weeks, we've alluded to this three-pronged strategy that the Democrats have. So the first prong is the legal strategy. So any executive order that appears to be unlawful, they're going to the courts and they're often winning. But that's the people aren't feeling that, right?
Yeah, it doesn't get you back in office.
Exactly. Now, I will say it's the most effective at stopping damage, but you're right. It's not going to get you back into office in 2026. So given the really thin majority in the House, and given that in order to get through the Senate, a filibuster-proof bill, it's going to have to either be bipartisan or they're going to have to use budget reconciliation.
So just to talk about the budget reconciliation process, once they've gotten to that point, right, they can pass things on a simple majority as long as it's revenue neutral as scored by the Congressional Budget Office and all that, and relating to budgetary issues. So you can't throw in things like, we want to make it illegal to buy beer on Sundays, which they wouldn't, thank goodness. But you can't throw that in there because it has nothing to do with the budget, right? It would have to be budget related. And I think you're right. And it's like the Republican Senate is right. And the odds of getting all this stuff lined up and passed by March are pretty slim, right? And as you mentioned, this is giving the Democrats some sort of leverage, which they don't have on anything else. Now, as you just mentioned, what do you do with this, right? How do you figure out how you're going to proceed? And as we've talked about, it's been hard for the Democrats to figure out what to say as a group because so much is happening. It's all over the place. Trump is, as the phrase goes, flooding the zone, and you're getting pinballed all around by trying to react to everything. And that's why, in my view, the big thing they need to do is not be reactive so much, not just be no, 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 no. They need to have something positive that says, this is what we're for, right? You then contrast that with what Trump's doing. Like, he's doing this, and he's threatening your healthcare. He's threatening your economic well-being. He's threatening your kids' schools. He's threatening all kinds of stuff. The safety of everything you hold dear, health, children, schools, is a threat. And we want to take care of everybody that way. We want to help the middle and the lower classes of America. We don't want to cut taxes on the wealthy, so we have to cut programs for you, right? We want to increase taxes on the wealthy and help you. We want to do things for the lower class, the middle class, kids, right? Healthcare, education, anything and everything that fits that is stuff the Democrats need to be for. And they need to be for it all the time. They need to get out there and they need to tell people there should have been ads in the Super Bowl, as we talked about before. There should be ads all the time. We shouldn't just be hearing from Trump because Trump is more than happy to take up all of the media landscape, right? The Democrats need to start clawing some of that back with a positive narrative that people can buy into. Right now, if you think, what are the Democrats doing? They're just trying to stop Trump any way they can. They're just opposing Trump. It needs to be more, you know what? They're trying to oppose Trump by working for us. That's what the Democrats need to do.
Yeah, and to go into what the House Republicans are pushing, they want to raise the debt limit by $4 trillion. So right now it's at $36 trillion. So it's roughly a 10% increase. They want to have $4.5 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years. And they want to reduce mandatory spending by $2 trillion. And that includes cutting $880 billion in Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act funding, and $230 billion in food assistance. This is over a 10-year period of time. And it's funny because the argument that the Republicans are using is that it's going to unleash so much growth that the GDP is going to skyrocket. And even though the deficit is going to increase, well, the debt to GDP ratio is actually going to decrease. That's their argument. And I just find that pretty laughable because the economy is already pretty strong right now. I know it's starting to slow down just a bit, but you're not going to get that kind of growth.
Well, you're just not going to get it. You're not going to get it, period. It's beyond laughable. It's just simple horseshit, right? Yeah. That's what Republicans have been spewing ever since Ronald Reagan came around, right? And George H.W. Bush, the first, coined the phrase voodoo economics to talk about Republican promises that cutting taxes will improve the economy and actually lower the deficit. It doesn't. It hasn't. It won't. It never will. It's such crap to think, oh, you know what? The wealthy are just sitting there hoarding their money because they don't want to make any more money because they'll have to pay too much taxes on it. It's just a preposterous idea. There aren't these massive pools of money available for investment that the wealthy are just waiting for their taxes to drop. So then they'll go ahead and invest. Otherwise, they won't. I mean, it's remarkable how wealthy somebody like, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or even Bill Gates has become with these high levels of taxes. And the Koch brothers, another great example. They're not worried about having more money to invest. They just want to keep more of what they've got, right? It's simple greed, right? There's no aspect of what they're saying that actually has borne out in economics. And we know this because they do it over and over and over. If this worked, right? Trump's already done it. Most of the tax cuts they're talking about are making his tax cuts that are already in place permanent or continuous, right? Okay. If this was actually working, wouldn't it have already worked? Wouldn't we have increased the GDP to such a degree that we wouldn't be having bigger deficits? Well, it doesn't, and it hasn't, and it isn't going to. It's just garbage.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, you said that you have to craft a narrative. We disagree where the focus should be, though.
Sure.
I believe that they should just focus on the healthcare aspect because it's a lot easier to it's almost like a sniper rifle as opposed to a shotgun, right? I think it'll just be more effective in that way. But either way, I think the Democrats, they need to figure out what their strategy is in terms of leverage, right?
One other thing I'd like to say about just where we differ a little bit, right? The reason I think it needs to be more than just healthcare is if you go back to the previous election and elections before that, people aren't voting based on their healthcare, right? They're voting, at least the movable voters are voting a lot on their pocketbook, their economic prospects, prices, things like that. If you just say healthcare, it's going to reach some of them, but not as much as if you talk about more of the complete package, right? He wants to take away your healthcare. He wants to cut your ability to buy things because inflation is going to keep going up. He's going to put in these tariffs. He's going to make everything more expensive. He's going to take money from your kids' schools, right? He's not for you. We're for you. I think that's a more convincing argument that reaches more people than just healthcare.
Yeah, it's a reasonable argument. I just don't know if the Democrats have the credibility to make that argument, given what's happened under the Biden administration, right?
That is another story, but that's also something they need to work on. Yeah. If they can't get that credibility back, they're not going to win in 2026.
Yeah. Whereas on healthcare, they are credible, right? Yeah. If the ACA funding goes away, the ACA is popular.
Yes.
So they have credibility there.
Imagine Trump has all his tariffs in, and what happens is what every economist think is going to happen, and it will increase inflation and cause all kinds of problems, hurt the economy in any number of ways, right? If your message is about healthcare, you've kind of missed.
Yeah, and that's fair. But that also requires the American people to have touched the hot stove, so to speak. And maybe that's what's necessary in order for the Democrats to gain that credibility back.
Sure. I agree with you there. And I think you want to be prepared for when that happens, because if he gets his way, it's going to happen. And if you've been saying this is going to happen, and hey, here it did, right? and we don't want to do this. We want to do something else. I think your narrative is more credible if you've been saying it all along rather than just at once there is emergency.
Yeah, that's fair. So we've talked about the first two prongs, the messaging and the legal aspect. So now it's the actual legislative aspect of things. The Democrats don't really have much power at all in the House and Senate. They are slow walking every nominee as much as possible. They've basically gotten rid of unanimous consent in the Senate. So that's pretty much all you can really do as the minority party. But as I said before, the Republicans have a razor thin majority in the House. I really don't see how they're going to be able to get anything done without the help of Democrats. And this is where the Democrats can really use some leverage, right? They can make the argument that, hey, we've been in this situation before. We had a really thin majority under Biden, the first 2 years of Biden, and look at how much stuff we got done. What is your excuse?
Yep. And yeah, I don't think they have an excuse, but they do have the reality that they have a certain number of representatives in their caucus, the GOP, that is just we're not for anything caucus, right? They vote against any possible spending. They want massive cuts to everything at all times, and they don't ever compromise. And that's sort of their badge of honor. And the idea of getting those people on the same page with the moderate types from the swing districts who have to go back in 2026 and try to win again, right? In districts that Biden won, right? That's going to, as you're saying, that's going to be very, very difficult for them to do, just because a lot of Republicans aren't interested in getting stuff done.
Right. And so I think what the Democrats need to do is figure out what they want. They talk about the lawlessness of Trump. Well, what are some guarantees that you can have in legislation that it's almost like a trap for Trump, where if he ignores it, that's going to help them when it inevitably gets to the Supreme Court, right? So you're going to need those guarantees. And you're also going to need funding guarantees for your sacred cows, right? So Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, anything with the Department of Education, what have you.
Yeah, and I think that's worth expanding on a little bit because normally when there's stuff that comes up that's bipartisan, people will talk about that and they'll come up with a deal for that specific issue, right? They'll come up with, hey, here's our deal for the debt ceiling. We'll give you this, we'll give you that, and then we'll go about our business, right? What I think is different right now is one, Trump won by kind of a slim margin. His majority wasn't huge. And he's acting like he got a 2/3 majority in the country, and he's just radically changing all kinds of stuff, trashing departments left and right, firing people, putting his own people in the government, ignoring court orders, which, again, we're going to have to get to later on because this is potentially really ridiculous. Just doing blatantly corrupt stuff with the Department of Justice, right? The Democrats need to do the, hey, break glass in case of emergency strategy, because this is heading towards a true emergency, not just the Democratic Party, but for basically the structure of our government, right? We are becoming a government where one guy is thinking, you know what? I don't have to do what the other people think we should do. We'll do what we want. And so you're right that they need to figure out what they want. But I think beyond that, they need to figure out what they want on a grand scale. What would enable us to go back to business as usual? We understand that we're in the minority and you've won. But let's go back to being a country where we have, hey, two sides, but we agree that there's some common cause to being Americans, right? And if Republicans won't agree to at least make some strides in that way, if I'm the Democrats, I would let it burn to the ground. Like, you don't want to deal with us? We're not going to deal with you. You're going to ram all this stuff through? Have a good time when the government shuts down. Enjoy the default on your watch, right? He's going to burn down the economy anyway. Why not let him do it all the way?
Yeah. And, under normal circumstances, I could see the Democrats being tempted to say, oh, you know what? If you eliminate the debt ceiling entirely, well, then you can't use it against us when we inevitably get back in power, right? The Republicans have weaponized the debt ceiling way more than Democrats. Yes. And that might be a good long-term play, but I agree with you that this is like a break glass in case of emergency situation. This is basically the only leverage that the Democrats have right now. Once this opportunity goes away,
Yeah.
we have
Trump is
nothing.
showing absolutely no inclination to be constrained by norms, the role of the office, or even laws, right? He hasn't listened to a lot of courts, and he's basically said, "Meh," right? We talked about the courts have said you'd have to give the money that you said the Congress is going to give. Well, they haven't, right? Eh, these are things that just they can't happen in our country. We can't do this, and internationally, he's the same way. He doesn't care about our alliances, our allies, anything. Whatever he feels like doing, that's what he's going to do. And as you said, this is Democrats' one and only chance to kind of get in the way. And if Republicans aren't going to compromise at all, Democrats shouldn't compromise at all. Right? There's no point in saving the economy for Trump if all that's going to do is let him continue to steamroll over everything that the Democrats think is important.
Yeah. So we will keep an eye out on this. The devil's going to be in the details. They have a high level framework, but I don't think that the Republicans are going to be able to come up with something that passes muster in both the House and the Senate. They're inevitably going to need the Democrats' help. And once we get more details, we'll talk about it then.
So that brings us to Department of Education. And I think it's an interesting sort of snapshot for us to take. That's why we're kind of focused on that in part this week. Doge is kind of going berserk across the government, but Department of Education is one of the specific targets of the Trump administration. So we thought it was a good microcosm in terms of what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it. And briefly, they want to get rid of the Department of Education. It's nothing new, really. The Republicans have been complaining about it forever. Right? It was part of Project 2025, so should have seen it coming. And Trump is all in on getting rid of the Department of Education. He's going to try by executive order to get rid of the Department of Education. And she raises a couple questions. Like, first, well, why do they want to do this? And second of all, are they going to be able to? Two important questions. And a lot of it is messaging, right? There's sort of kind of like three prongs of Republican approach here, why they want to do it. There's the people who like to own the libs, and they think, hey, we get rid of the Department of Education, it'll piss them off, and they'll be crying, and we'll have the precious liberal tears, right? There's the Doge folks, which just like to cause havoc. They think they're going to get in there and break stuff, and we'll break this by getting rid of it. But those people, I think, to me, it's kind of instrumental to get rid of the Department of Education. Like, yeah, we can get rid of it, don't really care, other than the repercussions it causes. The people that are the real believers in it are all about culture war, right? They want to be able to teach religion. They want to make sure that there's nothing being taught to anybody about gay and transgender people, right? They want the government oversight to be gone so they can do whatever they want, right? And these things kind of are coming together as sort of a perfect storm of what the GOP is going to do.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because we linked the Project 2025 plan in the show notes specifically for the Department of Education. If you read it, they clearly know what it does. They go through every single office. They know it well. Whereas I think the Doge folks and sort of we'll call them the online Republicans who just, want to see, the liberal tears, as you said, they don't really know what it does. And one of the things that we want to do is actually talk about what the Department of Education does, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions with it.
And I think it's also useful to point out, too, that traditionally it's been very bipartisan,
yes.
Right? The Republicans have gotten behind education funding the last, 30, 40 years, right? Just like Democrats. But now all of a sudden it's not. And it's obviously, I think that comes from the new divide in sort of voting patterns, whereas conservative suburbanites used to vote Republican, very educated people. Now they're voting more Democrats. So education kind of not so important to the modern GOP.
Yeah. So we have some stats on the bipartisanship of this. So the No Child Left Behind Act passed Congress 381 to 41 and passed the Senate 87 to 10.
This was under George W. Bush.
Yes, under W. Bush. And Obama had the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was 359 to 64 in the House and 85 to 12 in the Senate. So while Republicans like to talk about abolishing the Department of Education, they sure like the money. that goes to the constituents, right? And that's why these things are bipartisan issues when it comes to funding this department. So, we have to ask ourselves, is this trend going to continue? One of the reasons why we wanted to couple the episode on Department of Education with the budget outline is we're going to see what the priorities are, right? Will the Department of Education actually be funded come March? And I think that's going to be a really good signal to see where the party is going to go. Because, if this is just messaging, then Trump's going to say, oh, I tried to do it, but the court stopped me. Oh, well. And then the fund is going to continue to go through and almost no harm, no foul, right? But if they actually start following the Project 2025 plan, that's when I think things are going to get really hairy.
I was just want to add, is like, from everything we've seen so far everywhere else in the government, I'm leaning towards he's going to probably try to follow the 2025 plan, right? He's done nothing to indicate that he's just blowing smoke about all these things that he's trying to go through with.
I tend to agree with you that everything that he said he's going to do, he's done so far for the most part. So anyway, let's talk about what the Department of Education actually does. It is strange that DOGE is going after the Department of Education, because if they were actually operating in good faith, the Department of Education really wouldn't be a priority. There's only 4,400 people who work in the department. So it's not like you have a bunch of lazy government workers who are just stuck in the department and then you're going to be able to trim the bureaucracy and save billions of dollars. No, hardly anyone works there relative to, say, the VA or something like that.
Yep. And most of what they do is kind of pass through money, right? They administer grants and loans and special education money, stuff that goes directly to students and stuff that goes to schools in the various states, right? It's not like they have massive programs. They don't do any teaching, right? They don't write curriculum. They set some standards, right? And they make sure that schools follow some standards, but they oversee research, and then they oversee the distribution of money that Congress has appropriated.
Right. So, I think calling it a pass-through agency is a pretty good summary of what it actually does. Now, there is one other aspect that I do think is important, and that's the civil rights enforcement, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So, there's Title VI, which is racial equality, and then Title IX, which is gender equality. And then there's something called IDEA, which deals with disabled children. And every year there's about 20,000 complaints. And, the Department of Education goes through these complaints. They try to find resolutions. And if there's any sort of civil or criminal penalty, they'll deal with that, right? And then lastly, they do deal with accreditation, financial aid compliance, and student loan policy. So policy related to the pass-through of money.
Yes. And if you think about, those programs, the money that they're passing through, it's generally popular across the spectrum, certainly among voters, right? Pell Grants for low-income families, student loans, Title I grants for low-income schools, special education. Those things aren't really controversial topics, right? To target the agency that oversees that seems like, again, they're using culture war stuff to cover up what they're actually threatening to get rid of.
So what does Project 2025 say about the Department of Education? So obviously they want to get rid of it. That's the high level of it. But, their arguments on their face don't seem that crazy. But are they operating in good faith? That's the question we have to ask ourselves.
I have to disagree a little bit, because I just think the whole premise of, we live in the information age. That's indisputable. Education is very important to success for both the country and on individual levels. If you're not educated, you have a serious cap on how far you're going to get in the world. And if our country is not educated, we have a serious problem competing in the world. And anything that you do that diminishes the prestige of education, like, we don't need a department to be in charge of education, we'll just farm all this stuff out to other departments. You're diminishing education. That's just lunacy in my mind. we need to set a standard and model for the rest of the country that education is so important that we have a place for it in the government. When we're basically saying education matters so little that we're getting rid of the department that controls it, it sends a terrible message. So
Right.
I can't get past that. You can look at some of the individual steps, and if we were in a vacuum, we'll go back to that term we were using a couple weeks ago. In a vacuum might not be the worst thing in the world, but as a whole picture, I just am very bothered by the idea of we don't need a department of education. It doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get past the symbolism of it, right?
Yes.
So, when we talked about civil rights enforcement, well, you can move that to the Department of Justice.
You could.
Right? You could do that. The Institute of Education Sciences, so they're the ones doing all the research. You can move that to the Department of Commerce. Commerce does oceanography research, right? Commerce is basically the Department of Data Science. So again, not an unreasonable place to put it. And Project 2025 is also saying, well, we should have block grants with no strings attached. One of the things that has been going on since the Reagan era is Republicans love block grants.
Yeah, because then they can give it to the religious schools.
Yeah, no strings attached. Just here's the money.
Yep. And you don't have to there's no standards that get in the way. If you choose to teach religion all day and have the Bible in every classroom like they're doing in Oklahoma, you won't have to worry about your standards dropping because money won't depend on standards.
Right. And then student aid, let's move that to the Department of Treasury. Seems reasonable, right? And then some of these post-secondary programs, we can move that to the Department of Labor. So again, like on its face, if you look at each one of these individual things, it doesn't seem that crazy. But as you said, the general symbolism of it, it doesn't make sense because you are deprioritizing education. That's the first thing. The second thing is, suppose you do move the civil rights enforcement to the Department of Justice. Well, suddenly your law enforcement capability, you're competing with terrorism, white collar crime, all kinds of different crimes. So civil rights violations when it comes to education, where do you think that's going to be on the totem pole? Right?
Yeah, especially the Title IX stuff. I imagine they find it very easy to ignore that and give all kinds of rationalizations. But also, as you mentioned, we have to, if we assume that they're acting in good faith, maybe they don't sound so ridiculous. But I don't know that there's any reason to assume that they're acting in good faith. To me, it seems like, hey, you know what? If we farm all these things out to different agencies, then they're kind of all orphans. And if we want to get rid of them one at a time, that's not such a big deal. Nobody's going to make a fuss if we're eliminating Title IX enforcement in the Department of Justice, or if we cut back on Pell Grants or if we cut back on special education funding. That's all easier to do as it's a little tiny department in some bigger agency than, hey, this is the education department. We're making massive cuts to education funding.
Right. Yeah. So once you get rid of the department, you've already taken your hit when it comes to political capital, right? And then everything else after that, you're not going to take any more hits.
Sure. And also, like when it's in the education department, nominally, the head of the education department is interested in education and will fight for the education stuff. Stuff's over in the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury. The Secretary of Treasury or the Secretary or the Attorney General have a bunch of competing interests. Mm-hmm. They're not there to defend education. And if we really believe we don't need a national education policy, we're deluding ourselves.
Yeah. So to me, this is about messaging first and foremost, right? Saying that you're doing something and you're owning the libs. And from an efficiency standpoint, again, 4,000-ish employees, you're not going to really save that much money. But I think when you really dig deep, it's that nefarious true believers, so to speak.
The culture warriors.
The culture warriors who've really wanted to do this for a really long time. And they see an opportunity, and Trump is a perfect vehicle for that.
Yeah, and I think just to go beyond that, add a little bit more context to that, a large part, or at least a part of their culture war stuff is gutting public schools, right? A large part of the GOP agenda is, hey, we want charter schools, we want religious schools, we want states to fund these things. I read an interesting article in the New Yorker. They're recounting how Ohio is becoming basically the test lab for funding religious schools through vouchers at the expense of public schools. And the GOP culture warriors are all for that. Getting rid of the Department of Education makes it easier to do that.
So to bring this back home to sort of this budget fight, right? Because at the end of the day, we'll know in March whether or not the Department of Education is going to get the funds, right? What should the Democrats do? I think they need to be very careful because they can't be caught defending something that people just don't really know much about, right? I think they need to focus more on specific aspects of what the Department of Education does. And then when the Republicans counter with, oh, well, that's just going to be absorbed in other departments, I think you're going to have to come up with a really simple way of explaining to people that, yeah, you might be able to do that, but it's not actually going to happen.
It's going to shock you that I'm going to agree with you and go further and say the Democrats need a narrative about that too, right? You need a story. If you want to convince people in this country of anything, you got to have a simple story that they can buy. And so you're right. The Democrats need to say, these are the things that it does for you. Put that together and tell us, this is what it does for you. This is why it won't do it for you if they have their way, right? Give people a story that they can follow. If you just tell people, oh, they want to take this office and put it here and this office and put it there, people will be like, okay.
Yeah, whatever.
Right. They won't know. But if you tell them, you give them a story on why it's bad for the country and why it's bad for them and why it hurts their children, then they might pay more attention.
Yeah, I would have folks who have benefited from Pell Grants lined up and ready to go. I would have people who were in special education their whole life, but ended up succeeding against all odds, right? You got to get these stories ready to go because the Republicans are going to come at you fast and hard, and you need to be ready.
I think that's a good place for us to wrap up for the week because we did want to talk about both the larger scale budget battle and sort of a smaller element within it, the Department of Education, just to kind of start getting into the idea of what they're up to and what Democrats need to do to resist. I think, as I mentioned earlier, next week, we're probably going to be jumping into the rampant corruption in the DOJ that's exemplified by what they're doing with Eric Adams and trying to drop charges there. But who knows? There's so much going on. There might be a bigger outrage next week. So what I would suggest is try to enjoy something as a beverage that's a little bit stronger than hop water. It's just left me kind of wanting a beer.
Yeah. Amen to that. Anyway, make sure to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.